When it comes to the voter ID issue, also, one thing that doesn't get talked about very much is that it's also an issue about suppressing the woman's vote. Because they've done studies that show how many women change their names when they get married and don't change their ID, or when they get divorced, don't change their name back or change their ID. And it's actually 50 to 60% of women who could be disenfranchised as well.
Let's listen to what Hillary Clinton had to say about that. Let's watch this.
Now, the other day, Mr. Trump accused me of playing the, quote, woman card. Well, if fighting for women's health care and paid family leave and equal pay is playing the woman card, then deal me in.
Great point, doesn't she?
Yeah, I mean, the other side of it is, and Joe made a great point, but when we look at this whole process, the Founding Fathers got it right when they said, we the people. Part of the problem here that we have is that people go and vote or find themselves that their vote has been suppressed or they feel that they've been denied the opportunity to vote. But we don't stay engaged. We go, we vote, we wipe our hands, and then we expect our elected officials to take care of things. So it's like putting a kid in a candy store. If you leave the kid in the candy store, he's going to keep putting, or she's going to keep putting their hand in the candy jar and get as much candy as they can until someone tells them to stop. You have elected officials who every few years do gerrymandering, and they change the way the districts are drawn, depending on who the political parties are. Right now, what we're finding both on the national level as well on the local level, there are a lot of people that are recognizing that they can be part of this process. When people said that 2008, when Republicans said that change did not happen, they were mistaken. What we're seeing today in 2016 is a byproduct of what happened with President Obama and his change platform and his Ford platform in 2012. What we don't like is the reflection of what we're seeing, because now you have 330 million Americans that are now recognizing that their voice does count. That's what 2008 meant. And today, in 2016, we're seeing a lot of those other people who felt left behind that are also being part of this and being engaged in this process. So what we see within the party system, there will be some changes that come along, but the people have to be the ones that force it. We've been having this conversation about parties and delegates for, this isn't just the first time, this has been going on for decades.
Lenny, you want to say?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an important point, but it's especially important because people only tend to focus on presidential years, but it's those midterm elections that have a huge consequence on our political culture. You look back to 2010, when the Democratic Party not only lost Congress, but lost state legislatures around the country and gubernatorial seats around the country. So what does that mean? That's when we redetermine, when we determine the districting for the, based on the census every 10 years. The Republican Party had a strategy for 2010 to turn out their voters and to be able to run those state legislatures so that the gerrymandering would favor their party. And we're seeing the consequences of this. In 2012, in Pennsylvania, for example, if you accumulated all of the votes for the House of Representatives, the Democrats probably won Pennsylvania by 100,000 votes. Guess what? Out of 18 congressional seats, 13 of those seats went to the Republican Party.
And I have to explain to my listeners, and probably maybe even to an international office, what does gerrymandering mean? Right. I mean, what's the term? You know, it's a term where you draw a district and it looks like some lizard, and in essence, that's, and of course, it came out of Massachusetts.
And you make sure all your supporters are within that.
And you make sure that your party has the number. So the focus, and this is one of the things I said about Bernie Sanders people, because we're now hearing people who are saying, you know, I'm not going to vote because my candidate didn't win. That has got to be, let me tell you, that's the most dangerous thing that people could say. But to talk about playing the card, the women's card, that's the same thing we heard in 2007 and 2008, Obama's playing the race card. And it doesn't fly in this country, because if there's an issue, of sexism, of xenophobia, the people who get in there and fight against it, that's who he's arguing against. That's who and it's going to backfire on him, I think, even in the Republican Party.
Right.
So sort of playing the woman card, I think, isn't necessarily playing the woman card. Obviously, there are lots of issues that get piled into that category called quote-unquote women's issues that I think are really better categorized as family issues. Equal pay for equal work, paid family leave, things like that, that I think are more at the top of the agenda of many women voters than perhaps of men voters. And so if one is going to play, quote unquote, the gender card or the woman card, I think that might be how Hillary can bring some of those Bernie Sanders supporters in, not so much saying, I'm the woman, but I'm going to be there for you to advocate for these issues in a way that male candidates perhaps have not so much in the past.
Okay, Atiba, I want to get on to something else that we've been hearing a lot about this election cycle, and that is the money in the political system here in the United States. We've been hearing a lot about that, criticism of the campaign finance system. Of course, one of the loudest voices was that of Bernie Sanders. Let's take a listen to what he said.
The reality is that we have a corrupt campaign finance system which separates the American people's needs and desires from what Congress is doing. So to my mind, what we have got to do is wage a political revolution where millions of people who have given up on the political process stand up and fight back, demand a government that represents us and not just a handful of campaign contributors.
Campaign finance in the United States, is that just another name for corruption?
Before you ask me that, one of the things I wanted to go into was the idea that when we talk about these different issues that keep dividing us, it's economic. And so when you start talking about the political process and how much money is in it, whether or not you call it corruption or campaign finance, there is a lot of money that goes into this system. And when we talk about, we've been talking about women pay, we've been talking about family leave. We're not talking about the billions of dollars that are spent on these elections, or the fact that we have this primary system where it goes far too long, starts in January, we're going all the way till June, so much money that's being thrown at candidates. I think it's great that Bernie Sanders can say that 7 million people have given him $27 or more for it. But each one of these states costs money to run these primaries. Why do we have a primary system where all these different dates? Why can't we just have one date? That would cut down the cost in itself. And then we have this process of the Electoral College. When you look at the Electoral College and the candidates only going to swing states, but not trying to get the complete popular vote. So is this a democratic system, or is it one that's already rigged? And is it one in which, when people talk about campaign finance, we can talk about the Koch brothers, we can talk about how much money is being put in. Is the presidency being bought, is what a lot of people keep asking. How much of tax dollars are going into once the candidates win their party's nomination? How much of that money comes from taxpayers to go to these candidates? There's so much money that's here. How you address that, if it's through campaign finance, I don't know if you can say it from that standpoint, but what we do know is when the top 1% has enough money to be able to throw at a candidate, to be able to gain access, it takes the attention off of the little person who is now crying out and saying, me, 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 which is what we see behind Trump folks and we see behind Bernie Sanders folks.
Right.
But of course, there's no way to fix that. I mean, it's a great conversation to have at this stage of the game, but we've got Citizens United, we've got the Supreme Court who has ruled that these contributions are permissible, and until the Congress can pass legislation that can then get to the Supreme Court again to, for lack of a better term, trump that decision, there's nothing that can be done because those are legal contributions.
But there's nothing we can say that there's nothing you can do in 2016.
Correct.
But we have to also be looking ahead to 2018 and to 2020. And that process does not change unless people are engaged and stay involved in the process.
Okay, Lenny, I want to get to something else, something that was talked about today on the Republican side, and that is foreign policy. There was that foreign policy speech made by Donald Trump. And as we heard from our reporter at the beginning of the program, the themes of that speech was America First will be an overriding theme, I guess, of the Trump administration. No more nation building, as Donald Trump said. What did you make of that?
Well, it's a typical Donald Trump speech because really he was speaking like the deal maker that's part of his brand. Basically, he's saying that he's firm on the national interest, but he's flexible on how to accomplish it. That's really the sort of mentality of a deal maker, and that's really how he's been able to portray himself throughout this campaign. But at the core of his speech, it's a nationalist message. It's a message that America comes first, that our obligations abroad are fine, we have to exert American power, we have to exert leadership, but other people have to share, that America is sort of a chump We are spending all this money to defend other nations. They're getting a free ride, he's effectively saying. And because of that, we're not rebuilding our roads and our bridges and taking care of the things we need to take care of at home. So it's a very, very nationalist message. It's about strength, but it's also about focusing on the interests of the United States and solely on the interests of the United States.
You know,
Joe,
if America is first, then I tell you what he should do. Then get all of these so-called corporations that put their money off and offshore. I think the trillions and trillions, and I don't even know the exact figures now. I mean, it's in the multitudes of trillions of dollars, and it is said if they paid their actual share, I mean, and we're not talking about what even the Reagan administration required. You would have enough money to rebuild the infrastructure. But if you notice with look, let's quit. The media in this is part of the problem in this country. I'm going to be very honest with you. That speech had absolutely no specificity. None. None. And not one reporter had the audacity to say, wait a minute, what about this? What about that? How are you going to do this? We live in a global community where 68 people on this globe have more wealth than I think 1/2 of the human population.
Okay, Joanne, let me ask you about this foreign policy speech in another way. This is what Foreign Policy magazine said about this America First theme. It said, after years of American adventurism underwritten by neoconservative and liberal interventionist administrations, Donald Trump, knowingly or unknowingly, has consistently outlined a more restrained vision for America's relations with the world. And Foreign Policy says he is in sync with the majority of Americans.
I don't think he's outlined any policy. And notwithstanding that I was told by one of the people who was putting on this speech today that I might not want to attend because I might not understand it because it was so complicated on foreign policy issues, which it obviously was not. And I think he's trying to, I mean, he's obviously channeling a certain attitude and anger of the American people, but that's not the role of a leader. The role of a leader is to say what is best for this country. Let's take a look at what the country is doing, what is the state of the world, and for him to just continue with these platitudes of, we're going to build a wall, we're going to keep them out, that's not foreign policy.
Does that perhaps explain his popularity, that he's not good on specifics? He can say these bold
Absolutely.
Absolutely,
That's exactly right. You don't have to think when you hear him.
Heaven forbid.
There's no substance. For me, as a Republican, as a black Muslim American, he's offensive in terms of the language that he uses, in terms of this idea that, in terms of making America great, in terms of how he wants to do this. This is only going to alienate us further in the world. And that's part of the problem that we have today. America has this idea, we've become a real bully. America has this idea, and that bully recognized and found out that, hey, we can be attacked, we can be hurt, we're vulnerable. But the best way to protect our vulnerability is to find ways to be more peaceful and have a better approach to how we deal with other countries.
You tend to, you don't go to war with people you trade with. You don't go to war with people you have business relationships with. And what he fails to realize is that the United States is still the country everybody wants to come to and do business.
Okay, I've got a final question, and that's for you, Lenny, and that is, we can see the outlines of who's going to be competing against whom in the general election. How do you rate Donald Trump's chances?
I'm sorry, what was that?
How would you rate Donald Trump's chances in the general election?
Well, everything's possible in the general election. Donald Trump shows strength among a certain group of Americans. He may have the Republican Party unite behind him. That's still to be seen. If he does, he can to the sort of competition in the fall. And if he puts enough states in the competition because of our electoral college, there's always a chance that he can become president. But I wouldn't bet my house on it.
Okay, Leonard Steinhorn, Joe Madison, Joanne Bamberger, and Atiba Madyun. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Madyun in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.